Breaking news here in San Diego, day one of the winter meetings. The Mets wasting absolutely no time making a huge splash. Justin Verlander will be a New York Met. The deal reportedly 2 years, $86 million with a vesting option. Our very own Andy Martino is here. He broke that news. Jim Duquette as well. And guys, listen, on Friday night, Mets lose their ace, their longtime stud in Jacob deGrom, two-time Cy Young Award winner, and 3 days later they replace him with a three-time and the current reigning Cy Young Award winner in Justin Verlander. Andy, how'd this deal come together?
Well, Steve, the Mets were really tempted by Verlander even when they were still talking to deGrom. Verlander, the deal that they gave him fits what they want to do, which is, as you both well know, sort of wallpaper over some of their organizational flaws that Steve Cohen and Billy Epler inherited with expensive veterans, while they try to build out a farm system over several years, more sustainable organizations. They love shorter-term deals for veteran guys. I'm also told that Steve Cohen himself and Verlander really hit it off. Verlander, a very data-driven pitcher, very interested in the analytics side from Houston, and Cohen really liked that. They were a better personality fit, certainly, than Cohen and deGrom. deGrom never wanted to make that relationship, not just with the Mets owner, but with a lot of people in the organization. So the Mets are like, oh, man, we really like Verlander. I'm talking last week. But deGrom's our guy. Let's play that out. When deGrom goes to Texas, as we said and reported like minutes after that, it was front and center Verlander. Talks continued through the weekend. Verlander did a lot of due diligence on the Mets organization over the course of this past weekend. And then the Mets got a call within this past hour, I want to say about 45 minutes ago, from Verlander that Carlos Baerga had it all along.
Well, and I'll tell you, when you look at obviously how this deal comes together, I mean, clearly a couple of things, right? The Astros seemingly had told from their owner had kind of painted this picture a couple of weeks ago, like this is what he's looking for. He's looking for the Scherzer deal times 3, and that was kind of when you're kind of negotiating these type of deals, you like to have that information, knowing that if that's what he's looking for, and if you are willing to go there, you can get the guy. Obviously you have to go through some hurdles. The Dodgers were for real. Astros, though, were showing their cards that they were out. I'm not so sure there were other teams involved in those 3. Maybe the Yankees. Andy, you might have info on that. But the bottom line is this was a deal between the Mets and the Dodgers down the stretch. And the Dodgers had just as much money. They had just as much payroll flexibility, but the Mets got their deal. They closed out the deal, and that's what you're looking for, obviously, off of this year that he had. He's a guy that's going to give you 28 to 32 starts every single year. You know that. He's in tremendous physical shape after having that second Tommy John surgery. And, Steve, listen, this is a guy that when you look at it coming off of the Cy Young Award and leading the American League and ERA, like this is a perfect fit for the Mets.
No, I would agree with that, Jim. And it's interesting that you mentioned this is a guy that's going to give 28 to 32 starts, right? Because a lot of people will look at this deal and the fact that Verlander's entering his age 40 season and say, well, you've got 2 guys, yes, they're Hall of Famers at the top of the rotation, but 2 guys who, how much can you count on them to give you what you need throughout the course of the season? But you look back specifically with Verlander, and he has been a workhorse, has been able for the majority of his career to give you a lot of starts, to take the ball every 5th day. And coming off the season, again, as you put it, he made 28 starts last year. He led the AL in wins. He led the AL in ERA, a 1.75 ERA last year, a .83 whip, and an opponent batting average of 186. I mean, this guy was as good as he'd ever been last year. And so, I guess the question is when you look at that history and you look at the reality, though, of at some point it's going to fall off, how confident are you in what the Mets are going to get over the course of this 2-year deal?
Yeah, I mean, the question had been the gamble of, do you want to trust Jacob deGrom at 34, health-wise, who hasn't hardly pitched in 2 years, or Justin Verlander at 40, who is so good right now? And in some ways, it's a flip of the coin. Verlander is a guy who uses every tool available to him to try to stay young and improve his arsenal and all the technology and all the new training methods. At a certain point, that expires, obviously, and guys get old. But we're talking about a guy who, as you said, Steve, just won the Cy Young and had this great season. So I think it's as good a bet as you can have, certainly. that he's going to be okay for a year or two. You never know. There's all risk in here. All the top three guys, DeGrom, Verlander, and Carlos Rodon, came with significant health questions. So it's kind of like pick your risk, but at least this one's the shortest term.
We definitely see this uncharted water, right? I mean, when you're talking about 40, Steve, you're right. These guys, there is a little bit of an issue there. I think the same thing kind of goes with Scherzer, right? Both of those guys. I think you have to maybe manage the starts a little bit. They're going to need some more depth in that rotation. But here's the thing. For the most part, you can dial them in for a minimum of 20, 28 or so. That's basically off of their history when they're healthy. I think with Verlander, he hasn't had any arm issues. He didn't have any shoulder issues outside of the Tommy John surgery. I think he had a little calf issue towards the end of the season there last year. And, even watching him into the postseason, his stuff still played. His velocity was still up. It's not, Verlander from 5 years ago or 8 years ago, or he's throwing 98, 99. He doesn't have that left in the tank, but he's still a mid-90s fastball. His average fastball velocity was right around 95. He's got the curve, the slider. Like, there's a lot of similarities between he and Scherzer, the way they're built, the makeup, the competitiveness, the fire, all those things, the way they kind of reshape themselves on occasion, added extra pitches, whatever it might be. So I think all of those things kind of bode well for him being able to stay healthy during that stretch. And again, 2-year deal, which is something that I know the Mets were focused on, the industry. I thought that he might be able to get a third based off of the interest level, but I know that vesting option was important, which is similar that he had with the Astros this last contract, which allowed him to opt out.
All right, Jim, let's talk about that vesting option and just the contract breakdown in general. It's reportedly first 2 years, $43.3 million for the same AAV as Scherzer got, a no trade clause, full no trade, and then the vesting option in the third year for $35 million. What do you think of how the contract is structured?
Well, the vesting option, I think, is a fair way to kind of bridge the gap, right? If he's looking for 3 years, a lot of times, and you don't want to get to that third year, a lot of times you can get to that by going this vesting option. And basically, the idea around the vesting option is you have to earn it, right? It's a number of innings. Usually it's combined over the 2 years, or the last year it's a certain threshold. This past year with the Astros, his threshold was about 125 innings. He blew right through that and got that. So, usually it's one that you don't have a problem giving that third year if he earned it. And so I think from that standpoint, it's a reasonable risk. I've seen guys, really gut it out that second year, so they get the third year guaranteed, and they're not the same. But, with Verlander, the thing for me, when he said earlier this year he wants to pitch till he's age 45, nobody out there is going to deny that Verlander has the ability to do it. There's only been a couple that have done it. Nolan Ryan, and I don't like making the comparison because Nolan Ryan, his innings are like over 5,000. Verlander's not that, but there are guys in the sport that have done it, and I would not deny that Verlander has that possibility too.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And, he's got that intangible too. He and Scherzer, they're different people. We've gotten to know Scherzer here in New York better than Verlander, so it's easier to speak to Max and how he conducts his business. But one thing that they seem to have in common is that, like, in the term of baseball, is like he's a dude, right? He's like an alpha. He's a guy who, that once his stuff starts to decline, as it already has to some extent, although we just won a Cy Young, so I'm not sure, like maybe the velocity's down a little. But once that physical decline happens, he's going to have that competitiveness in him. It's still a guy that you'd want out there in a playoff game and all that kind of stuff. So length of contract, you don't know. I mean, again, we talked about the risk before. You don't know how that's going to play out, but he's the kind of pitcher and kind of competitor that you bet on. I mean, you do look at what other teams are willing to do. Jimmy asked me about the Yankees earlier. The Yankees and the Astros, I was told this an hour or two ago, were just out at this price level. So it's not like every team, or at the length and the price, I should say. So it's not like every team that liked Verlander thought this kind of term was a good idea. But every team has different context too, and there was no other way to replace DeGrom this coming year for the Mets. So they I don't like to use the word need in these things, but they kind of needed him. I mean, when the alternative is Chris Bassett, Jamison Tyone, etc., I mean, Rodon comes with a potential 5 or 6 year commitment, so that's a whole other conversation. So Verlander really was the only guy who was perfect for what the Mets needed going forward, which is one of the reasons why they stayed in at this risk level beyond what the Yankees and Astros were willing to do.
I also think too, though, when you look at it kind of based off of what you're saying, Andy, with the need, like that, if you're the Mets and it's a short-term deal, it allows you to extend a little bit more than maybe what other teams are. And that's why I felt like that it was the Mets and the Dodgers that had the best chance of getting him because they both need him. And for me, the alternative wasn't great. If it wasn't Verlander, Rodon, they didn't really like all that much. He's a second more on their list anyway. It seemed like he was more of a second tier guy, and he's going to get big money. Like he's going to get 7 years. So if you look at the risks of guys that are available, top guys that could try to replace DeGrom, this is almost a perfect fit by comparison. I wouldn't want to go to Rodon for 6 or 7 years, which I think he's going to get. And then the drop off from there is kind of a next tier. So, Steve, I think that part of it too, when you look at all of those, scenarios, it doesn't bother me that the Yankees are out. They have a guy that's high level. They don't want to pay anybody. Okay, Houston has a ton of starting pitchers, and they're parking their money more in the offense. So it made sense that it was going to come down to these final two teams, and thankfully the Mets got them.
And you know what, guys? I want to go back to something that Andy said a moment ago about as Verlander's stuff diminishes, they'll still have that competitive nature. I had a conversation last year with Max Scherzer, because if you look at Scherzer and Verlander and what they did last year, I know it didn't finish great for Scherzer at the end, but they were really on historic paces, parallel historic paces, doing things and putting up numbers that nobody really in the history of the game at their age had put up. And I was talking to Scherzer about why that is. And he said, when you talk about it, he admitted like his own stuff is going down a little bit, especially in comparison to the way stuff is going up across Major League Baseball. But these guys, not only are they so competitive, they're so smart. And when you look at how generic a lot of hitters' swings have become, they find ways to exploit that. And these analytics, I know a lot of people give analytics a bad rap, but there is so much information for these two pitching geniuses out there that they really have figured out ways to exploit hitters' weaknesses. And that's why I think you're seeing what you've seen over these last couple of seasons, and why, again, when you're talking about the risk reward, yeah, I understand that it's always a little bit risky to go into a season with two guys. You're counting on two guys that are upper 30s into their 40s. But if any two could figure out ways to continue their level of dominance, I really do think it is Scherzer and it is Verlander. And again, the risk because of the term is not very high. Now, Andy, I want to go back to you about coming to New York, because last year there were all those rumblings about, will the Yankees pursue Verlander, and that never really came together. So what, if anything, changed with Verlander's desire and willingness to come to New York City this year?
Well, that's right, Steve. And the Yankees were under the impression last year that after their dealings with Verlander that he was not interested in coming to New York. And the Mets were aware of that because, look, the Yankees offered him 1 year and 25. The Yankees kind of felt like ultimately Verlander took that offer back to Jim Crane in Houston, got more out of the Astros rather than, obviously came to the Yankees. They extrapolated from that it wasn't going to work going forward, which is why I never really thought they were very serious players for him this time around. I think the connection that he made with the Mets organization can't be discounted, certainly, but also just the money. I'm not saying this is a bad thing at all to Justin Verlander, but it was expected at this point in his career that he was going to basically follow the money. And I'm sure that he'll have more to say about New York when he's introduced and what the fit was and who he connected with and why he made the choice. But ultimately, Steve Cohen made him a very aggressive offer, and he took it. So I think at the end of the day, when you're making that kind of money, you can live well in any town or a suburb of it. So I don't think it's a huge factor.
Yeah, right. I'm with you. And I think it was about, this. He's setting records. This is a record, tying deal, right? It's not a breaking deal because we know Scherzer's there. But I mean, when you're and rightly so, they're both compared and they're both the best. I mean, if you look at over the most active wins of any starting pitcher, now the Mets have the number 1 and number 2 on that list. It's Verlander and it's Scherzer. Greinke's in that mix too, but it's the top 3 guys. They have 2 of them, and really, if you look at them, it's the tandem. I think you'll get more productivity out of these two than what you obviously got this past year. What the high expectations of what those 2 guys, DeGrom and Scherzer, were going to be. So you look at that. Obviously, Carrasco is back, and I think Carrasco still has plenty left. So now with the debate is, all right, do you go with the young guys, right? Do you go with McGill and Peterson, that kind of mix, Do you go out and get another guy, a lesser guy, which I think, we've talked about a little bit, whether it's Tyone, maybe it's Andrew Heaney, that list of guys. And, I think, that for me, they're short one guy on the starting rotation because they're going to need depth. There's no denying that. So, be curious to see what part outside of going after Nimmo and finding a relief pitcher, they need one more starter in every indication. And it looks like they're going to pursue another starter.
They will. We talked about this on your radio show yesterday, Jim. I think the Mets are leaving here with 2 starting pitchers or closing a deal with the starting pitchers soon after here, however it shakes out. Verlander had to happen before the starting pitching market really started to move in earnest, so that has happened. That was priority number 1. Tyone, Andrew Heaney, Jose Quintana, is it someone who they've had contact with? So you can look at that category and say that they're going to sign one of those guys. Who ends up getting more than who's a 1-year deal guy, who's a 2-3-year deal guy will be interesting to see. But those are the guys they met with most, if not all of those pitchers in that tier. Chris Bassett's not totally out of the question, although his market, I hear, is not like he's taking it a little slower than some of the others. There was a report that he wanted 4 years. I heard actually that Bassett hasn't communicated to teams what he wants yet. That's just moving a little slower. So he's in the mix. Taijuan Walker could be in the mix. Basically, pick another starter and see who they can make a deal with.
Guys, when you look at Verlander and how he's evolved as a pitcher over the years, we've talked about obviously that he clearly still has what it takes at an extremely high level. But Jim, how is he a different pitcher now than he was when he was first coming up?
Well, I think when he first started out, he was a guy that there was a little criticism early on of him being able to go deep in the game, right? And I remember a time somebody, I think it might have been Jack Morris, who kind of challenged him, and all of a sudden he was pitching deep into the game. He would always seem to save a little bit of extra velocity later in the game. As the game went on, he got better, which isn't unusual, but he'd kind of start out trying to pitch, 2 pitches early on in the game, which you see an awful lot of times, but it'd be 93, 94, and all of a sudden he's darting 98, in the 4th, 5th, 6th inning, and he ends up going 8 or 9. So I think that, that's number one. Number two, similar to what Scherzer, Scherzer was a fastball slider guy. Then all of a sudden he develops a changeup. Then he adds a curveball. Verlander is very similar in that sense of fastball, slider, changeup. He adds the curveball. He loves to mix and match. He's now pitching up in the strike zone, going back to the conversation earlier, finding those areas now, weaknesses in hitters' approaches where, you can throw that fastball up in the zone. That's why I like how this might age too, because of the fact that these guys are unique in their own way of how they've been able to pitch at a high level for so long. And the metrics really favor pitchers still when you are trying to come up with a game plan against hitters. It's such an advantage for guys who know how to pitch. Even listening to Scherzer earlier this winter talk about how he's going to use the pitch clock to his advantage to try to speed things up. I'll guarantee you Verlander will be doing the same thing. You'll be seeing a lot of that going on too. So, for these 2 guys feeding off of each other, I think it's going to be fun to watch.
I don't know if the rest of the world got to see that extreme close-up of Jim that popped up on my screen a minute ago, but if you did, it was a treat. Anyway, what are we talking about? Verlander's improvement as a pitcher. Jim just filled my screen ahead of yours. Anyway, so Verlander.
It was the best part of my day. Best part of my day.
Absolutely. And everybody else's too, all that's watching. Verlander did, when he got to Houston, he was really big on taking advantage of a couple specific things. That Rapsodo camera, which takes, I believe, 5,000 frames a second. So he used that to impact his grip, help him with his pitch selection. It was a big influence on Garrett Cole's evolution that way too, becoming a guy who pitches high in the zone with a slider. Using that data, using that high-speed camera, and all the real-time information that the Astros have on your arm angle and your arm slot and all kinds of crazy biomechanical things in-game. So one of the ways that he went from being that young gun with the Tigers into being this sort of Nolan Ryan of the modern age is through all that technology. The Mets have invested heavily in that stuff over the past couple of years as well, and will continue to. And that's one of the reasons he's been able to not just sort of hold his stuff, but improve it or alter it in some ways as he's aged.
And you know what, guys, I'll tell you something else. And at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is Is Justin Verlander going to pitch well and pitch every fifth day? And the same goes for Max Scherzer. But one of the things that, I tried to speak about it often last year, but it probably did not get talked about enough, and people probably didn't understand, is the level of impact that Scherzer had on the pitchers around him. And when you're talking about a Mets organization that really is actively trying to change the culture to build a winning clubhouse, not the easiest thing to do. Bringing Scherzer in, along with Buck Showalter, really changed a lot. And so I think when you look at what this team has in a rotation moving forward, we know that Carrasco will be there. We know that now it's headlined by these two guys, and you've got McGill and you've got Peterson. Having Verlander and Scherzer on the same staff will have a huge impact on those two young guys in McGill and Peterson, who have shown obvious flashes, but still need to figure out how to put it together on a day in, day out basis at this level. The Mets aren't done either. We know they're not going to rely on those two guys. They're not going to rely on that being the 5-man rotation. But I really do think when you talk about the collective and what this team is trying to build, that's just a separate bonus of having a guy like Verlander in the clubhouse. Now you've got two of them in Scherzer and Verlander, two of the greatest pitchers of their generation, two of the greatest pitchers of all time, who can begin to pass things and continue to pass things down to these younger pitchers, younger players, as they look to change the culture and the view of this Mets organization.
Steve, that's a good point. I'll tell you one thing on Verlander to that point. Prior to his Tommy John surgery, he wasn't a guy that was maybe as outgoing in that area as other pitchers, as maybe what you're talking about with Scherzer. And he specifically talked about that this year after being out through Tommy John and really being away from the game, how much he missed being a part of a team, missed being in the clubhouse. And it was a different Verlander personality-wise. Anyone around the team, and I was around the Astros a lot during the early part of the season, but also at the end, anyone there was saying, hey, this is a different guy. He's a much – not that he was a bad teammate, but he wasn't as engaged as a teammate, and he was this past season. And I think that's something that, sometimes it happens a little bit later in your career, but Verlander and Scherzer together, I think, is going to be a lot of fun in that clubhouse for some of those, young starting pitchers that you're talking about.
That's true, and that could be a draw. Transitioning back to what they're going to do next. I mean, when you talk about some of these pitchers now, I mean, again, these deals are always about money and fit and personal reasons and family. But if the Mets are looking for a separator with a Tyone, with a Heaney, look, Jameson Tyone, I covered and got to know very well with the Yankees. He's one of these pitching nerd guys, too, that loves the data, loves to talk about it, loves the analytics. So all of a sudden, I mean, if he's been talking to the Mets, you look at it, we have these two future Hall of Famers that like this stuff, too. So this becomes another potential selling point as the Mets now pivot forward for the rest of the week and try to land that other pitcher. They've got starting pitching. They've got bullpen. They got Brandon Nimmo. They have a lot to deal with, but now they can tell these free agents that they're recruiting, look, we're trying to win a championship here, and we have two Hall of Famers in the rotation.
It becomes a huge selling point, to your point there, Andy. I think that's, whatever we went through the starting pitching and who they're next going to pursue, Brandon Nimmo is still next guy in line in terms of high profile, in terms of what they do next. That market continues to rise. It's in that 120 to 140 range. It looks like, and there's still a number of teams. At last count, there was at least a half a dozen teams that are still interested in Brandon Nimmo. So that looks like that's going to take some time. I don't think by the time we leave here in San Diego that's going to be fleshed out. If it does, it's going to have to really move a lot quicker than it has so far. So that one you're going to have to wait on. There's a reliever or two that I think they're going to be in on. We've talked about this relief corps. They need Ottavino. They need Andrew Chafin. Like that group of names is next, I think, on the list too. I would not be surprised if they leave with another starter and at least one of those relievers by the time we're leaving here Thursday.
Yeah, guys, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think this team is going to be active on the pitching front specifically while we're here. As you guys have mentioned, they're looking for that mid-tier starter to kind of round things out on the starting staff, but they need to rebuild an entire bullpen, and they know that. And so you're going to see multiple guys. I don't know how many relievers will come off the board right now, but you're going to see the Mets in on multiple relief pitchers. And then in terms of what they do, whether it's Nimmo or I know Joel Sherman reported Benintendi, and there's a bunch of work to be done. The one thing that I will add, though, is we saw it last year that Billy Epler, this front office, they play things pretty close to the vest. And the only thing that really leaked out, and it was at the very end, was the Scherzer deal, the Scherzer interest last year. But you had that one day where it was Marte and Escobar and Canna, and nobody had that coming at all. And then even the deal for Bassett, that wasn't on anybody's radar. And so when you look at this Mets, whether it's now or this Mets offseason in general, the one thing that is clear is that they're going for it, right? You don't sign Edwin Diaz to a record contract, and you don't sign Justin Verlander with that type of money if you're not planning on competing for a championship this year. So they are going to be very active in filling holes. The question is how much of that is going to be on our radar, how much of that is going to come out of the proverbial left field. I just think you have to kind of, if you're a Mets fan, you be patient and you kind of wait and see what happens and have some trust that they're going to go for it and what form that will take beyond just the mid-tier pitchers and filling out the bullpen and trying to find that center fielder. I don't know exactly what that's going to look like. But obviously this is just the start here in San Diego, getting off to an early start, but we'll have much more to do here today, specifically 6 p.m. BNNY. We'll be back in New York breaking all of this down and more, and then we'll be here live at 6:30 doing Mets Hot Stove. Billy Epler will join us to speak about Mets Hot Stove, to speak about this deal and what else is to come. And then we'll be live, of course, at 11 with Honda Sports Night. So much more to do here today. And should anything else happen, you'll see this 3-box once again, Andy, Jimmy, and myself. But for now, once again, Justin Verlander, a New York Met, 2 years, $86 million with a vesting option. The Mets have their top two aces.
Well, bye, everybody.
Justin Verlander heading into 2023.